All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Jamie Besantz. I'm the Visitor Engagement Coordinator at Soldiers Memorial Military Museum. Thanks for attending our virtual program tonight, a virtual tour of a nuclear missile launch control center. Safety is a top priority, so nearly all of our programming is virtual right now, but the museum is open Wednesday through Sunday with several safety precautions in place, and we'd love for you to visit if you feel safe. We're recommending advanced reservations at all 3 of our locations. You can visit mohistory.org to plan your visit and reserve free tickets. Before we start our program, I want to thank all of the Missouri Historical Society members for enabling us to put on programs like this. There's a link in the chat where you can find the web page to become a member if you're interested in that. I need to quickly mention a few details about how today's program will run. So we'll start with a 10-minute introduction by Rob Branting, who will give us some information, some background information about the Cold War and the nuclear program in the United States. Then we'll have a 20-minute tour of a facility in the Dakotas, followed by 10 to 15 minutes Q&A. You can submit questions through the Q&A button on your toolbar. Chat is disabled for attendees. We'll do our best, but we might not have time to get to everyone's questions. Today's presentation is being recorded, so if you'd like to view it again or share it with others, it'll be posted on our Missouri Historical Society YouTube channel. Your feedback is important to us. We would appreciate it if you could answer a few questions after the program. A Kobo Toolbox survey will open in another tab in your browser as soon as the program ends, so keep an eye out for that when you leave the session. So without further ado, our speakers tonight are Mark Sundlove, the director of Soldiers Memorial Military Museum, and Rob Branting, who works with the State Historical Society of North Dakota. Got it.
Okay. Well, hello from north of Cooperstown, North Dakota tonight. Before we get started, I just want to point out that Mark Sundlove was the first site supervisor out here at Oscar Zero, and this place wouldn't be what it would be today after all the interpretive groundwork he laid for this site. And it's great to see him on video again, and good to see you again, Mark. All right. Well, without further ado, let's do, this is a first for me. Let's do this screen sharing deal here. Let's see, we do that. And you'll see me there for a second, and then you'll see this, hopefully. Hopefully everybody's seen our kind of our intro page for the Ronald Reagan Minuteman Missile State Historic Site. We also go by Oscar Zero. We're actually made up of 2 sites. We have the Missile Alert Facility, also known as the Launch Control Facility, where I'm at right now. And we do offer tours throughout the year. In the wintertime, they're by appointment. The shoulder seasons, they're a little bit different. Just check out our website at with North Dakota State Historical Society of North Dakota website. Just look us up, Ronald Reagan. We're the first one that comes up. But also the November 33 missile silo site, known as the launch facility. That's the concrete pad you see there in the middle of the image there. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that tonight. Otherwise, you see our building there. It's been very quiet. I think we haven't had any guests out here for a week, and we certainly welcome by appointment tours. So without further ado, let's get going. So just give you a little bit of background about the Cold War. You're looking at the period 1945. It's just one of those significant years in human history that you're getting towards the end of a catastrophic war that was just, you look at the history and it's just profound on both sides. But basically, you're seeing the old colonial powers, the United Kingdom and France, are basically very weakened by war. The United States basically is coming to the forefront. They're supplying a lot of the nations with their war material, and of course, contributing their own troops to European and Pacific battlefields. And on the other side, you see the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. very militarily strong in 1945 when they enter into Germany, but they're also exhausted by war. They've lost over 25 million persons in a very just catastrophic campaign on the Eastern Front. But you're basically seeing these two powers are the big kids on the block now. And one of them has the atomic bomb. In July 1945, the United States tests its first atomic bomb in the New Mexico desert. And the thing is, the Soviets aren't super far behind because there are spies in the Manhattan Project program. And that's a whole nother history in itself. We can talk a lot about the social, the economic, a lot of things, the proxy wars, Vietnam, Korea, Afghanistan that occurred during this profound time. But tonight we're going to talk a little bit more about the arms race. So you're looking at 1949, the Soviets detonate their first atomic bomb. It's called Joe-1. You look at pictures of the bomb before it's detonated, and it looks an awful lot like an American atomic bomb, and that's no coincidence because they had those spies in the program. And just wanted to mention too, state of Missouri, you guys have a profound Cold War history. You look at Fulton, Missouri with the Iron Curtain speech. If you're not familiar with it, it's definitely warrants a look. And we'll talk a little bit more about Missouri as we go on here, but just wanted to show you some pictures here. You're looking at the United States is basically in the 1950s, basing a lot of their strategic nuclear deterrent, as it's called, aboard their bombers. But you're starting to see other weapons come along as well. Basically, you see it's called the Atomic Anti-Artillery Gun. There was a big push in the 1950s to miniaturize nuclear weapons and adapt them to a lot of different purposes. And you see the Regulus missile there being shot off a ship in the US Navy. But on the other side, the Soviet Union, yeah, they're developing strategic bombers. That's known as the Tu-95 Bear, but they're not as prolific as the Americans. What you see below that is what is known as the SS-5 intermediate range ballistic missile. NATO, they call it the NATO code name, the SS-5. Basically, you're starting to see those being built in greater numbers in the late 1950s. And essentially, that's where the Soviets start heading, is that they want to base their nuclear weapons on missiles. And we get here to this point. Sputnik, launched in October 1957. The world's first artificial satellite. You know, the Soviet Union had beat the United States into space, and that was a fascinating time as far as the United States believed it was technologically superior than the Soviet Union. And this was quite a shock to not only, you know, the civilian and the scientific community, but all of a sudden, hey, defense planners say, if they can put a satellite in space, they could put a nuclear warhead on that thing. And essentially what you're seeing is that the United States is investing in a lot of long-range radars in the mid to late 1950s, but they can't pick up missiles. A bomber attack by the Soviet Union would be several hours. You'd get a lot of warning from those radars in the far north of Canada. But the ballistic missile, that's coming through space, and you have about a 28 to 35 minute flight time from you know, bases in the Soviet Union to the United States. Basically, you're not seeing until the 1960s. We might get 15 minutes warning. And those were precious moments to basically get your bombers in the air, Strategic Air Command bombers, to potentially retaliate. And the United States is playing a little bit of catch up as far as warning systems and their own ballistic missiles. So from here, you know, the Atlas missile was in development well before Sputnik, as was the Titan. And what we're seeing here is the Atlas F and the Titan 1. These were liquid-fueled early ICBMs. That one we saw before, they called it the SS-6. I believe it was Sapwood ballistic missile. These are all liquid-fueled missiles because that's the technology they had at the time. And the interesting thing, you look at the Atlas F, and essentially you're seeing a lot of, you know, not steam, but condensation, because you have an oxidizer that's been pumped into that missile, a liquid oxygen. It has to be kept at 273 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit to keep it stable. And RP1, which is a refined form of kerosene. So you're looking at a very dangerous combination. These missiles, I should say, they were rockets when they were being used for NASA, whereas Atlas put up John Glenn's famous orbital flight with the Mercury program, and Titan was later used for Gemini missions. But essentially, these missiles were built as intercontinental ballistic missiles, and they served their role fairly well in the early 1960s. They were very bulky. They were very fragile. I'm not sure about the Titan one, but that Atlas F had a thin. The thickness of the skin was no thicker than a dime in some places. It had to be pressurized, or else it would fall in on itself like a pop can. So they were very, very delicate. Let's just say that. But they were in service in time for the Cuban Missile Crisis. These systems were out by April 1965 because the United States says, hey, we're on to our next generation of missiles. And let's talk a little bit about those. The Minuteman missile was being developed in the late 1950s, but it was at a time when solid fuels, basically something you can store inside a missile, was still fairly early in development, but it's going through a very rapid development phase on its own, because Minuteman provided basically an instantaneous launch, whereas those Atlas and Titan missiles, if they were lucky, they got 15 minutes to fuel the missile and potentially fire it. Minuteman, you're looking at moments after the key turn that we'll see on the video here. But you're looking at 1,000 Minuteman missiles overall across the northern Great Plains and Missouri. Effectively, you're looking at what's called the land-based deterrent force that came online basically in that mid-60s period and finished out the Cold War period. So essentially, when you think of rolling prairies, windswept plains, you see these missile silos. It's interesting to point out, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, is that Missouri sites, you didn't have that as much. It was different country, So the red areas, I just want to point out, there's still actually about 400 or so Minuteman missiles, the Minuteman III variety, still in service. You drive 3 hours west to here towards Minot, and you'll see active missile sites. Same goes in Montana, Malmstrom Air Force Base, and F.E. Warren down there in Wyoming, Colorado, Nebraska area. So the areas that are in black basically have all been deactivated. So Ellsworth, 1995, Whiteman was around, closed around, I believe, 1995, and Grand Forks by 97. So we're talking about Missouri. Let's talk about Missouri here. It's really interesting. You get folks up here who, they think either the missiles have been all taken out of service, or they were kind of astounded to know they were actually around. The Air Force was not exactly low key about it, but basically things started to blend into the countryside as time went along. And that is very much the case in that what was known as Wing 4, the 351st Strategic Missile Wing down there in Missouri. These are 150 missile silos east of Kansas City. Essentially, what you're looking at here is those stars represent buildings like I am in right now, that launch control facility, and the triangles are those missile silos. So essentially what you're seeing here is it's about as far south as they get with Minuteman. Most of them, as we mentioned, were up here in the northern Great Plains, but they had something of a starring role. Wasn't the best probably portrayal of them in what was known as the Day After, a 1983 ABC made-for-TV movie. Basically, sorry if there's any Tiger fans out there, but a lot of the movie was filmed over there in Jayhawk country. But essentially what you're seeing here is these, people are looking over and seeing contrails go into space, and they're saying, the Russian missiles are going to be here right away. It's not a very happy movie. Kansas City has a role in it too. I won't give any spoilers away, but it's not too good. But basically, the one thing to remember about these missiles is that they're in the ground, and if they were fired, the overall theme we try to convey at our site is that launching the missile represented essentially mission failure. They're there to preserve peace in whatever form that was during the Cold War. So, all right, well, we'll move on to our area up here. It's a little bit more, a little bit better map here of our missile wing, 321st. They were known as the Deuce sites. Wing 6, these were among the last missile silos ever built by the United States. And that meant they had some different ideas built into them. So essentially, the earlier Minuteman sites, you're looking at Eisenhower era thinking of massive retaliation. They're well protected, but basically you're coming to the 321st sites. It's very much representing that President Kennedy flexible response idea. Also his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, in that there's a lot of redundancy in these sites. They're given the option early on to be able to retarget their missiles. And they're using a lot of technology that's coming into being in the 1960s. And we'll mention it down below, the integration of integrated circuits using different radio relays. And it's a, to me, it's a, well, I'm a little biased since I work up here, but it's always been just a fascinating outlier of the Minuteman system. And there's a lot to learn. So we have a lot to share on tour if you're ever up here sometime. Basically here we're looking at construction of one of the missile sites in 1964 to 65 time period. I'm not sure if Missouri had this problem as much as they did in eastern North Dakota. You know, they were out there in the summer. They're like, let's get this concrete poured and cured before winter comes along. There was a little bit of a groundwater issue in the area as well, but when those snows came in and when it got cold, I've learned, I'm from Nebraska originally, sometimes when it gets cold up here in November, it just stays cold up until April. So not, I shouldn't say a rushed process, but it was very much a rapid development. So they got those sites poured, 150 silos, 15 control centers very quickly. And essentially, it's just an interesting note of engineering, how quickly they got these sites done. The electronics installed and the missiles installed, everything's operational by December of 66. So this is something you won't see, of course, on the launch facility tour, the self-guided tour out there in November 33. In fact, if you go out there today, all this stuff that's down below is filled full of gravel. But this is what the underground area looked like at the missile silo site. So you're looking at that launch tube. It's about 90 foot deep. The missile was suspended, and basically that meant it could hopefully ride out a near miss of a nuclear strike. But essentially, you're seeing battery backups at the bottom there of that gallery area. You might see that it looks like a coin. It's a personnel access hatch for maintenance personnel to come down and work on the missile if needed. One thing to note is that these sites were very much unmanned for that regard. So the capsule nearby was emergency power and chilling equipment, and you'll see that something really similar on tour here momentarily. So this building here is representative of what were called those Wing 6 sites. I'm way in the back right now in one of the bedrooms. It's been converted into an office, but just go over really quickly, that support structure housed the enlisted personnel on site, a cook, facility manager who took care of things, and security personnel that would patrol the area and protect the missile silos if needed. So that area where you're seeing the elevator shaft go into the ground basically is where we're going to start the tour momentarily. So let me stop sharing the screen and we'll turn it back over to Missouri.
Hey, this is Mark. We're working on the audio issue here. You just give us a moment. Get this straightened out.
Hello again from Oscar Zero. I'm Site Supervisor Rob Branning. If you're ready, we'll head on downstairs. We just went through the Security Control Center. We're looking at the elevator here. It is a freight elevator, so it does move. So let's close these doors here. It's going to take about a good minute 45 seconds to get down to the 50-foot level. There we go. Now, these missile sites with the 321st Strategic Missile Wing, Grand Forks Air Force Base, were, again, among some of the last ever built by the United States, so they are built a little bit tougher. You're looking at about a foot-thick wall here, although as we get further down, it gets a little more secure. Basically, we're going to come into a kind of a common area in between the two capsules, and those two capsules represent basically the Launch Control Center, which will be on our left as we exit, and the Launch Control Equipment Building, which will be on our right. So we'll see that Launch Control Equipment Building first. Now, why be so deep? 50-foot level. In the 1960s, Russian missile technology just wasn't that super accurate. They were making up with that with basically large yield nuclear weapons. So when a nuclear weapon detonates, you think about Hiroshima or Nagasaki, those were airbursts. They were basically used to create a lot of surface damage against what were called soft targets. Now, Oscar Zero is what's called a hard target. It's buried down below, it's very well protected, so it would necessitate what was called a ground burst to make sure the control center was destroyed. But even if this control center was destroyed, there were still 4 other control centers within the 448th Missile Squadron that could take over the missiles here. So Oscar Zero nominally had that control to fire 10 missiles. If other sites had been destroyed, they did have another capability to fire all 50 missiles within the squadron. So remember, 3 squadrons, 150 missiles. Each missile, the Minuteman III, possessed 3 nuclear warheads. So we'll exit out here. It's a fairly common temperature down here year-round at the 50-foot level, and it stays relatively dry. So here is it's a small diorama, kind of hard to see. It essentially kind of represents where we are in the scheme of things. The Launch Control Center, we're actually down there right in between those 2 capsules. And of course the missile silos that were located anywhere from 3 to 18 miles away. So let's get a chance to go look inside the Launch Control Equipment Building here first. The door behind me here, that's a 13-ton blast door. It was so well balanced you could move it back and forth by hand. To get it to lock, you had to pump an actuator arm about 100 times to get pins to extend into the wall here. And the 8-ton blast door for the Launch Control Center is about the same way. So we're coming through here with this little corridor here, 4-foot thick concrete walls with these capsules, 1/4-inch thick steel plating. There's an awful lot of steel rebar in and around these 4-foot thick walls. So you might have heard a little acoustic change there. It's kind of neat. There's a line here where it kind of turns into an echo chamber. Back behind me here, hopefully I'm not moving the camera around too fast, we're looking at the shock isolator unit. These were hydraulic. They acted like shock absorbers because everything in here was mounted on a false floor. If you had that near hit of a nuclear weapon, basically what that would mean is that there would be a tremendous ground tremor, kind of like an earthquake. Hopefully everything would just kind of sway in here instead of break apart. So we see the shock absorbers also back here. Basically everything inside this capsule was meant to keep that Launch Control Center running. It was supposed to be hopefully all automated. You're looking up to 6 weeks, possibly beyond, to support that Launch Control Center because we're looking at a different time in America's nuclear history, that we're coming into the basically the Kennedy era when they're designing these sites. And Kennedy and his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, basically asked, let's make sure we can run these sites for what was called a protracted nuclear war. Essentially, it wasn't everything being shot off at once. It was kind of a horrible scenario of maybe, a few weapons going back and forth at a time. So you wanted to make sure these sites were reliable and they could operate for those several weeks after that initial nuclear attack. Because of that, they had an emergency diesel generator down here. It was turned on periodically, about a monthly test to make sure it would still work. 6-cylinder diesel. It had a day tank back behind here that would allow diesel to fuel in from the outside to make sure that would run, and also a lubed oil tank to make sure, you know, that engine was adequately lubricated. You had basically over here a 14,000 gallon tank on the outside of the capsule that would help essentially keep that diesel fuel running, and hopefully they can keep electrified down here for up to those 6 weeks, possibly longer. Sites normally ran on commercial power. This is a power distribution group back here. Essentially, there's an old story where they said if they closed down, when they closed down these sites, 150 missile silos, 15 control centers, it was like taking a medium-sized city off the grid. These took a lot of electricity. Even today we use three-phase power, it's called, which is actually better suited for industrial applications, and it results in a fairly high electric bill. We'll look back here at the air intake fan. You can see it a little bit better up here. If you go topside, you'll see two mushroom-shaped domes on the outside of the, basically right east of our parking lot. One is an air intake, one is an air exhaust, and this is the air intake. It would bring in fresh air from the outside. It would help run cooling systems, but also provide fresh air for the crew that might be down here in the launch control center. Normally this area was not staffed, so usually very loud in here as well. Exhaust fan would take out some of that hotter air, the exhaust of the generator, and send it back topside. To protect those units from blast overpressure, it was called, they did have a blast valve hydraulic control unit that would essentially sense the blast of a nuclear weapon and shut off the ways, the ingress and egress, I should say, to the site to make sure instruments in here were not destroyed by overpressure. The brine chiller unit is interesting here because you're looking at 1960s electronic technology, and that ran very hot. You're thinking in the days before microchips, integrated circuits are just coming online. In fact, the old story went half the production line was going to the Apollo space program, the other half was going to Minuteman missiles. So essentially, with some of that older tube technology, things got really hot. It needed a dedicated air conditioner to send coolant, that glycol mix basically, to the air conditioner unit and the launch control center. It was a fairly complex system. We're going to head back outside the launch control equipment building here.
Jamie's going to pause the video here just for a moment and try to get the audio synced back up with the video. We apologize for the technical difficulties, but Rob's more fun to walk when his audio is synced up, watched when his audio is synced up with his video. So we'll just give this a second, and then Jamie will resume, and hopefully that'll work.
The doors normally stay open at all times today. They're really heavy to move. You might have seen in some movies where they're automated. That is definitely not the case here. This one, 8-ton blast door here to the Launch Control Center, had to stay closed. Basically, you're radioing back to base to get permission to open it. You had to have a good reason to open this, and essentially it would protect the crew within from that nuclear blast that might potentially happen outside. So you look behind me here, this area is actually not nuclear proof. It's hard to say really anything's nuclear proof, but you get beyond this door here, we're gonna look inside the tunnel. It's a lot more protected in there. Interesting figure here, the no loan zone 2-person concept applies. It was and remains U.S. Air Force and U.S. military policy for that matter, that around nuclear weapons or the ability to fire them, you cannot be left alone. It's a strict policy, and essentially that is a rule to govern the safety of nuclear weapons. Space Command had control of this site in 1997 when they closed down. The last alert, 17 July 1997, it says 13:15 local. That essentially means 1:15 in the afternoon. And that's essentially when they closed down operations for the site. It then went into a caretaking mode for a few years before the Historical Society got a hold of it. So we're heading through the tunnel here, a little bit of a low bridge. Looks like you don't have to worry about it too much over there on the camera side. But we'll look a little bit in here. We're on the outside of the enclosure room, basically before the Launch Control Center like kind of operations. We see back behind us here some artwork. They call that the Sunflake. It's a joke in North Dakota that North Dakota has a whole 2 seasons, winter and summer. Well, we've also heard winter and construction. The Warrior of the North, there's a big Viking heritage up here. So if I'm talking basically to anywhere else in the country, there's a favored football team up here, let's just say that. LFA board, it's kind of hard to see right here, a little bit of a glare of that light. We'll just say it means last final alert, but these numbers, these names represent missileers who were here, and the numbers represent the amount of alerts they served. There are some ladies and gentlemen on this board who served, you're getting close to a full year underground, because remember, those are 24-hour alerts, possibly 48 or 72 hours underground if there had been a blizzard ongoing. Some food resources were available: microwave, refrigerator. Sometimes they'd bring down those foil packs. And the bathroom here, believe it or not, is quite large compared to other Minuteman sites. So we'll head on in, without any further ado, to the Launch Control Center kind of operations part. Now we're heading down a corridor with electronics. Most of this has to do with communications. The big part of this mission was communications to the outside world, and that on a basic level was telephone, and it went all the way up to satellite communications by the 70s and 80s, low frequency, ultra high frequency via aircraft, a lot of ways to make sure they could get the word down here. This is the deputy's console. It's also called the status console. Essentially, there would be a person here at all times, even if one person was asleep, monitoring the status of the missiles. So each row here represents one missile silo and what might be going on, at the site. They wanted to keep things what were called clean and green, which meant strategic alert, everything's good to go. If there were problems, there were fault lights, they could print out a fault message to determine what was going on and possibly send out a maintenance crew. That would take up some time as far as, communicating to the field. So other times it could be very quiet. Other times you could have exercises going on. In those quiet times, I should mention that these crews were typically not too far out of college. So the Air Force did provide a master's degree program that many took advantage of down here. Otherwise, you're reading magazines. Behind me here, we have a television that came in later on. Basically, a lot of studying going on. And then later on, possibly some TV time. This communications console here with the Missile Combat Crew Commander Station. Essentially, what we're seeing here is a lot of different ways to communicate to the outside world. Low frequency communication system here. Another shock isolator. Everything in here, again, is shock isolated. These shock absorbers would hopefully keep everything just kind of swaying in here if there was a near hit. This is kind of our pride and joy here. If anybody, I don't know if that's looking right on the phone there, who are you going to call? Very much a throwback to those 1980s. But we are Oscar Zero. A lot of the sites had some really cool artwork that was relevant, of course, to their what was called the NATO phonetic code name. So we have basically the Eagle here, 448th mascot, as the Missile Combat Crew Commander, and the deputy here as Oscar. They're carrying their technical order books, and essentially the kind of that pride of the missile field was that they had scarves that would denote certain colors for different squadrons, and a way to kind of make them set apart from the rest of the U.S. Air Force. They did go into flight suits by the year 2000. And actually, if you can see behind me here, we do have some what they call crew blues, what they might wear. Sometimes they would come down here. It was a little bit chillier because of that air conditioner unit, and they might swap out for sweatpants, something a little more comfortable. So some of the communications racks back here. We have the air conditioning unit, and we'll talk a little bit about the missile launch process. So in the event of a valid launch order, they call it an emergency war order, something would come over these speakers here, luckily. I shouldn't say luckily. Essentially, there was a lot of ways to get the word out from that National Command Authority, the U.S. President authorizing the use of nuclear weapons, and this was the end of the line for that. They would hear an alarm, sounded something like this. It would be followed by a code set that they would quickly both write down. So you have the deputy sitting here in their seat, the commander back over there. They would write down the code, and they would both give each other authorization to enter this red box here. Each person had their own locking combination. They actually took these home with them at the end of their shift. I should say at least back to base. So you had the code book in there. You had the missile launch keys. So you sat down here, strapped in. There's actually a seatbelt with this chair because you never knew if that Russian missile was going to detonate very close by. You're possibly looking at, if you're lucky, 28 minutes warning. By the time the word got here, it was probably a lot less. So there would be an authorization basically to enable the missiles. There might be a conference call going on to make sure everyone got the word to launch. We'll head back here. There's a launch enable code that would be inserted to basically unlock those missiles for launch. The commander's key turn is back down here. Now let's get a little bit closer look into that. This is an example here of a launch key. Commander there. We're going to head back on over to see where the deputy would turn their key here too. So no big red button. It was all about a key turn. You had to turn those keys within 1.2 seconds of one another. A launch command would be sent to the silos, but you would have to wait for another launch vote. Another launch control center in the area, or also what was called the Airborne Launch Control System, an aircraft that might be within about 200 miles, could back up basically your key turn. Took 4 people, 2 votes, the missiles would fire. At November 33, you wanted to be anywhere else when that process went into motion. Launch and process meant the umbilical connected to the launch to the missiles was detaching. The missile would launch and fire. Essentially, that 107.5 or 110-ton blast enclosure door on top of the silo would be flung off at 35 miles per hour. The missile would fire. You have a 16,000 mile per hour top speed, eventually a 30-minute flight generally towards its target. The consensus was it was either in the Soviet Union or possibly China. When that missile landed, you have 170 to 350 kiloton nuclear weapons. These are quite a bit larger than the Hiroshima bomb. But essentially, it was going to be a bad day for everybody. Once the missiles were launched down here, I mean, everything was about a checklist. That's what these technical order books that we have displayed here kind of denote. And essentially, turning that key meant mission failure. These missiles would have failed to keep the peace. And luckily, we never got to that point, or I would not be talking to you today. You talk to the missile leaders down here. They talk about their jobs being a lot more mundane. Of course, there was that always possibility of war. They trained for it and trained for it and trained for it to make sure they were proficient. But again, luckily, we never got to that point. So by 1997, they're closing things down. This goes into kind of a caretaker status by the Air Force for a while in 2008. State Historical Society of North Dakota picks it up. And here we are today, many years later. So let's talk a little bit more about the capsule here. We're going to wrap things up shortly, but antenna sets, battery backups. They did have the generator in the other launch control equipment building, but essentially if that failed, they did have batteries for about 6 hours to be able to launch those missiles just in case. The bed, one person was allowed to sleep at a time. Normally it wasn't the best sleeping. It sounded like you're basically inside an airplane in here. So we'll head on back through here. There's an old joke that around this loop, it took about 88 laps to make a mile. Just for, you know, possibly something to do. Back up there, that silver thing there is the escape hatch. It's a 500-pound steel door that was aptly named the Deputy Killer. Goes to the idea that commander would say, "Hey deputy, I outrank you, please open that door for me." There are no basically hinges on that, there's just chains. So if you got that door open, you got out of the way really quick, but in the process you'd still be probably buried by sand, or you'd be digging out through sandstone like solid, not quite rock, but the worry was the sand over time got really hard. So it's a 30-foot tunnel from here to the surface. You have about 4 or 5 foot of dirt that you would dig up through. We think it comes out from around our basketball hoop if you ever get a chance to come out here. So we're going to wrap things up. It looks like we're getting towards the 20-minute mark. If you go to any other launch control center, you know, F.E. Warren now has one, Quebec one, basically the state, Wyoming State Parks, and of course our sister site down there, the Minuteman Missile National Historic Site. We think they could be pretty envious of us, and envious because We are what's called the last of the Deuce capsules. These are much larger than any other launch control center that was in American service or currently is. So we'll stop it from there. And we hope you had a nice tour. We definitely invite you to come up here. We're open by appointment in the wintertime. And during the summer, we have some various hours in the shoulder seasons, but during the summer, we're open every day, 9 to 6, or excuse me, 10 to 6. From the Oscar Zero Launch Control Center, 50 feet underground, just north of Cooperstown, North Dakota. My name's Rob, and we'll talk to you next time.
All right, apologies for the tech issues, everyone. We're about to move into Q&A here.
Rob, that was great. Thank you very much for taking the time to record that video for us. And it's a rare opportunity to see inside of a launch control center that was responsible for that type of nuclear weaponry. So thanks for taking the time. Hopefully, get past this COVID, people will maybe consider a vacation and go on up and visit you there and really see and kind of feel what that space is like. It's hard to capture in video, I think, but once you get on that rumbling elevator and drop 50 feet below the earth and walk into behind those concrete blast doors, you really kind of get enveloped into what that feeling was like. But I know we do have a couple of questions. Rob, do you want to try to sum up the differences between this site and another one that you mentioned at the end that people can visit, which is the Minuteman Missile National Historic Site in South Dakota? Maybe what the key differences are that they'll see, at least in the physical structure of the building and the facilities.
Right. Well, we're the better site. So it's always, we have kind of a running, it's not a rivalry because they get a lot more visitors than we do because they're on I-90, they're on their way to Mount Rushmore. In fact, my internship was down there, and one of the most amazing summers I ever had in my life, exploring the Badlands on my time off and giving tours at a Minuteman site with an amazing staff, and they still do. So the big differences are, I should say, that namely, our site is just bigger. If you go visit their launch control facility, the missile alert facility, it's a lot smaller in size. The kitchen's a little bit smaller. Basically, they don't have as big a rec room. It's more of like a day room combination, living room. But the joke is basically, well, they get, I believe it's around 250,000 visitors a year that come through that area. We get about 4,000. It's been less this year, as you can imagine, but they have an elevator that was only built for 2 people. Ours was built for freight, so we can have a lot more people on our tours, but essentially they have one capsule down below. It's a smaller launch control center, but it's still just a fascinating experience. And it's just kind of the evolution of sites. They were some of the first Minuteman sites. We were the last, but they have a really cool, you can look down in their Delta 9 right east of Wall, their missile silo. You can see their trainer missile in there. It's a really cool experience. And their visitor center that's fairly new is a great place to visit. Highly recommend it.
Yeah, and I think part of that, my understanding was that the equipment building where you started your tour, which held the diesel generator and those kind of survivability equipment, that stuff at the South Dakota site is above ground rather than below ground. And that, I think my historical understanding has been that was a response to what you had mentioned earlier, and that was Kennedy's approach to a flexible response and increasing the survivability of these sites, and that they weren't strictly a massive retaliation. We got a whole list of questions, so I'm going to try to cook through these, Rob.
Gotcha.
Here's another great one. This is for those of us who work in the museum field and the historic sites field. But being that the site was only shut down in 1997, We imagine that you host veterans who actually worked and stayed on those sites. What's that experience like?
Just like tonight with you, a former Missileer, let's just say a little bit intimidating. I saw, actually, I think there might have been a few Missileers on the video here, and it's just like, you know, sometimes it's like, if you want to lead the tour, we'll follow you and listen, because you have so many more experiences, you have so many more stories than we can ever hope to share, and it's really cool. I love it when you get other visitors who come on a tour with a former Missileer. It's like, hey, they got the story, they lived it. So, you know, we milk them for as much information as we can as far as their stories, and it's an amazing experience every time.
Well, you certainly do a great job of interpreting what is a very complex site, and you know that it comes loaded with lots of questions and challenging issues. There's some interest, as you know, there's always interest about the escape tunnel. Can you provide some more information about that, and maybe what the tunnel would have been open? Was the tunnel open to the elements, or did they need to dig out, or just maybe a little deeper into that topic?
Well, I believe it was a 500-pound steel door that they would have to open up, but it's a corrugated metal tube that I want to say runs at a 30-degree angle that comes up from, we think, around the basketball hoop. But it was filled full of sand for the point of, you know, if you have that nearby nuclear hit, the sand would hopefully act as a buffer. But there was still like a 5-foot area that you would have to dig up through, and they would use kind of a lance digging type tool to get up to the surface. But that was very much a dire last ditch way to get out.
Our joke about that tunnel was that after a nuclear blast and the heat that would come from the nuclear blast, you'd have the longest window in North Dakota as the heat turned the sand into glass. Some dark missile humor. But another question is, it appears that the air intake, and you talked about those blast valves, could draw in radioactivity. Was there a way that they could filter out the radioactive air before it, you know, contaminated the equipment building and the control center?
Right. You're looking at, let's say for some reason the Russians targeted Minot and not Grand Forks. You would have a great deal of nuclear fallout that'd be falling east of here, or in this area. So basically, a lot of that fallout particulate matter is just sitting and resting on the surface. Where you look at like fallout shelters, they're basically in basements, and it's like, as long as you have pretty thick concrete, it's not that the air is necessarily going to turn poisonous, but it kept you away from that radioactivity that was emitting for several weeks that was going on outside. There was a filtration system, I want to say it's called the Makeup Air Fan, that was also rated for biological and chemical agents.
And another, not related, but how many, you mentioned at the end of your video tour that there are some other Minuteman missile sites that folks can visit. Not that we want them to, we want them all to go to your site, Rob. But can you maybe give us an idea of which sites are open and maybe which one's closest to St. Louis?
Well, it's a little, I understand it's on an active, it's at Whiteman, so it's on an active base. It was the only launch control center on an active Air Force base. Usually they scattered them out. They're called Oscar 1. We were called Oscar 0. It's a whole different naming system, but if you get a chance, that's a cool place to visit, except you just have to make, I believe, some ahead reservations to find a way to get on base. But otherwise, out west, you're looking at South Dakota. We call them the other Dakota, with the National Park Service. Quebec 1 just opened up last year. It's an amazing site. It's like a modernized Minuteman site that only closed down in 2005, but they operated the Peacekeeper missile. And lastly, the one else I can think of, it's not very close to St. Louis, but it's down there in Arizona, Green Valley, the Titan Missile Museum.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that's good. If you can get down to Arizona and see the Titan missile, then compare that to the Minuteman system, and you can see, if you actually go to Titan and then go to South Dakota and see the Minuteman II site there, and then up to your spot, Rob, you can see kind of the evolution of the ICBM technology that the U.S. employed in a lot of different ways. This question is about targeting. If there ever was a launch, where are the coordinates for the target entered? How does the missile know where it's going to go? Would those have been given to the individuals launching the missiles, or would they have been entered at another location?
Well, I might reflect a little bit on this. It sounds like maybe an answer you might be able to field a little better than me, but there was, you might have seen it on the video, there was a keyboard where you can enter in some information, but what would you say? What would you say?
Yeah, it actually changed. You know, when the site opened up at Grand Forks, those targets were actually entered by crews that had to go out to the individual launch facilities and enter target coordinates there, and actually do some other work to make sure that the missile was going to be accurate. And then as technology progressed, they added the ability to the launch control center for the crews, the 2-officer crews, that they actually entered the coordinates by keyboard, and then those were transmitted out to the missiles. The important thing to know about that I'd like to stress is that the targeting of the missile wasn't it's not an action of launching the missile. So the day-to-day, the missile is sitting there with its known coordinates and it's where it's going to go when it's launched. So it doesn't, so that step does not slow down the launching process. So as things change, the crews gained the capability to target the missile. But Rob talked a little bit about how it takes 2 distinct launch boats coming from 2 separate locations or 2 control centers to actually launch a missile. The targeting is done in somewhat of a similar way, whereas there is a second control center that knows what coordinates you're supposed to be sending out to the missile to target it. And that second control center is basically checking the data to make sure that the coordinates are correct and that there hasn't been a mistake. Rob, here's another one. How long was a typical shift for a missileer, and how many hours were they underground during that shift? And what percentage of their shift would they train conducting exercises and drills? Do you want me to take that, Rob?
Sure.
And this is another thing that, history is tough because things change over time, but during a great portion of the system that Rob's responsible for trying to interpret up there is that the crews went out for 24-hour shifts. So let's say they departed the airbase on a Monday morning. They would get out to the control center, they'd go below ground, and they would change over with the off-going crew. And then they would be there. The new crew would remain inside that control center with the door closed through the rest of that day and into Tuesday morning when the next crew was on its way out. So they ended up being out there for 24 hours, and they would be below ground that entire time. And percentage of the time that they would conducting exercises and drills, and they do some exercises. I wouldn't call them drills. They have on base, they have 2 simulators, 2 control center simulators, and the crews were, every month each crew would sit for about 4 hours inside of that simulator, running through a number of different exercises and drills. And then when they were out in the missile field, they didn't, when they were actually in the control center, they didn't do that type of activity, just to keep it very clear for the crews what was real and what wasn't. So there was nothing presented to crews while they were on duty in the missile field that would, where they weren't clear what was going on, if it was an exercise or if it was the real thing. One final question, I think. That's all of them. For being in use well into the 90s, the technology seemed quite dated. wasn't there concerns about decades old equipment and computers?
You know, we get that question quite a bit. By the mid-1990s, they were going to a new console at the other Minuteman sites called React. But as Grand Forks was closing down, they just kind of decided to stay with what they had. The thing about that technology was it was very proven. You know, they didn't bring in stuff without going through a lot of tests, a lot of ways to make sure it wouldn't fail, especially in the event of if you needed to launch right away. So it's funny, we have a little data process. It's not a data process, it's a modem downstairs that basically it held floppy disks. And you read recent news, and like by 2015, Minot had just gotten rid of those floppy disk drives because basically they couldn't get a hold of the company to get new floppy disks. They were out of business, but I mean, they weren't making them anymore anyway. But it just meant it was very reliable technology. Hacker proof isn't the right way, but it was kind of a closed loop system, and it was just judged to be very reliable by that point.
Second. We have one more, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jamie, and Jamie can close it up. But one last question is, how often were the missiles serviced? And do you know what the shelf life of a missile was in terms of the fuel for the rocket? And was there ever a worry of it becoming unstable?
That's a really good question. Minuteman was designed to sit out in the field for a long time, but it did require, heating and air conditioning. With that solid fuel, the old story went like if you develop cracks in the solid fuel, that was a big issue because basically it meant the fuel wasn't going to burn right in flight. But that's a question I can't quite answer. I could potentially get back to this person on that. I'm not sure if Mark, is there anything you can add?
No, I don't know what the shelf life was, so to speak, for that solid rocket fuel. I think by way of importance, I would just stress the history of the technological development. And you'd shown some slides of the Atlas and the Titan missiles, which were liquid fueled rockets, which were incredibly dangerous and really posed a great risk. And when they went to the Minuteman, it's a completely solid fueled missile. So it's a difference between the analogy I use, which is fairly poor, but to give you an idea, is it's from switching from gasoline in these liquid fueled rockets to like a log, like a solid matter that needs to burn. And so that solid fuel was incredibly more stable and much safer than the liquid fuel that the earlier missile systems had. But I'm not exactly sure. They certainly had maintenance teams that could go out to the field, remove the warheads, extract the rocket portion of the missile from the launch facility and take that back to base and do things like Rob was mentioning, check for cracks in the fuel and see if it had cracked, and which would cause a failed launch or whatever other problem. But yeah, so that's probably the best we can do. I'm not sure if we can get to a shelf life answer, but I think that's it. Rob, any parting shots before we turn it over to Jamie? I want to thank you so much for taking the time. It's good to see you. I respect the work you're doing up there. It's an important site. It has, to me, and I always thought it had at minimum national historical importance, but really international historic importance. And so thank you for doing what you're doing.
Well, again, thank you for getting everything off the ground up here. It's just coming up from Nebraska to North Dakota. It seemed kind of intimidating. It's like, oh, it sounds really cold up there. It's not that much different from Nebraska, and there's just an amazing amount of Cold War nuclear history up here. You look at Tacoma, the Pyramid, the ABM system up there, the long-range radars, the bomber bases at Grand Forks and Minot. It's a really cool state to study.
Yeah. Thank you, Rob. Jamie, can you take it on home for us?
Of course. I don't know if I can speak for the rest of the audience, but this is a topic that it's really interesting to get kind of in a behind the scenes look, if you will. I wasn't aware that sites like that were even accessible at this point. So So if anyone is interested in, we record all of these kinds of programs and post them to YouTube. So if you're interested in watching any of those, I put the link in the chat. I also put links for subscribing to the Missouri Historical Society newsletter and becoming a Missouri Historical Society member if you're interested in supporting us in that way. Thanks again to Rob Branting and Mark Sunlove for sharing their knowledge with us today. As I mentioned before, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. As I mentioned before, when you close out, there will be a toolbox survey. We would really appreciate your feedback with that. We're putting, Missouri Historical Society is putting on programs like these 2 to 3 times a week. So please do come to the next one. You can find out about that on mohistory.org or on Missouri Historical Society's Facebook page. I think the next one has to do with Thanksgiving.
That's correct, Jamie. Yep. It's a Native American look at Thanksgiving.
Gotcha. So yeah, thanks for tuning in, everyone. We'll see you at the next one.